Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. So, Redshift is an effect that happens when something is moving away from you very, very quickly. It actually shifts toward the red end of the spectrum. Now, this effect was used by Edwin Hubble in 1929 to prove that the universe, like the scope of a poorly planned project, is constantly expanding. Now, every day we see redshift in technology, as technology companies try desperately to chase the ever-advancing goal of modernization. Every company I've ever worked for, whether we're talking about a small mom-and-pop small-town museum that was just wanting a new Mac, up to the massive multinational conglomerate that wants to upgrade their entire infrastructure, everybody wants to modernize. It is the current buzzword that is going around. It is the most important sales point. Modernization is key. Today I'm going to tell you about two such companies. One is Heartland Payment Systems, one of the sponsors, I believe, of this gathering. And the other one is a company called Factor. Now, these companies have a lot in common, and these similarities led them both to decide that they needed to modernize their entire system. But they also had a lot of differences, and those differences are why Heartland Payment Systems is still around and has its infrastructure up in the cloud, and why Factor no longer exists. So, both of these companies had a top-down bureaucratic system that discouraged any kind of innovation and really pushed against new ideas and anything that would make things increase in speed. Speed is dangerous, and that was a major issue. We had employees who didn't bother questioning authority and wouldn't even bother suggesting new features because they knew that these new features were going to be ignored and there was no point, they were wasting their time. Customers, as a result, were leaving these companies looking for better companies with faster software, faster turnaround times, and so the companies knew they had to do something. They knew they had to modernize. And as any intelligent company does when faced with a term they really don't understand, they decided to hire a team that does. And so both of these companies hired a team of full-stack developers who knew how to write, test, and build and deploy code. They mixed these new developers in with existing developers who already had all of this tribal knowledge of how the system worked and what kind of system they were dealing with. And they hoped that by mixing these two groups together, they would end up with one solid, beautiful, unified team that had all the tools necessary to be productive and all the skills necessary to modernize. But reality is messy, and it really didn't work out that way. What we ended up with was a team of individuals who each had their own methodologies and their own goals and their own way of doing things. And at the center of both of these teams' world was the monolith, a massive piece of monolithic code built out of hundreds of thousands of lines of self-conflicting code made with band-aids and bad ideas. It was a mess. And it was incredibly fragile. Anybody who's ever had to deal with this kind of code knows that any change carries with it massive risk. And any attempt to fix or update the code is going to lead to a bunch of unexpected changes that you are going to have to explain later. So bug fixes are only absolutely done when they're absolutely necessary, and new features are absolutely unheard of. We don't even bother with them. It's somebody else's problem. Somebody else will do it someday. And this kind of code universally sits on some kind of ridiculously archaic architecture that is built around the flaws and insecurities in the code. And so this kind of architecture requires a special kind of person to work with and a special kind of mind to work around. The code and the infrastructure are so tightly coupled that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. And this is where the first big difference comes into play between Factor and Heartland. Factor hired a bunch of, as I said, full-stack software developers who knew how to build, test, write, and deploy code. Heartland did the same thing, but then they went a step further and hired a bunch of system administrators and infrastructure engineers who knew how to deal with this architecture, which would come in handy later. Now, the company had made the decision to modernize. They had hired the team to do the modernization, and now that team had to answer a very important question. Now what? Modernization is a wonderful buzzword, but what does that actually mean? And how are these teams going to do it? First thing we knew, we had to come up with a plan. We decided early on that the goal was going to be to move the system into the cloud and to automate as much as we can. And the idea behind this was we wanted to be able to shorten the feedback loops and increase the rate of deployments. In order to do this, we needed to work out the plan, and to do that, we had to find a way to make all the software developers and systems administrators work together.
You're talking about both companies or hardware?
Both companies. Both companies had the same issue, and both companies handled it in more or less the same way. The first issue we had to deal with in coming up with this plan was, I'll tell you a secret, I don't know if you all know this, but software developers, system administrators, and architects all tend to have one thing very important in common. They're all fairly egotistical. We have to be certain that the code we are making is going to work. We have to know that we know what we know. We have to know what we don't know. And that brings with it a level of confidence that doesn't always play well with others who disagree with our ideas. And so the first thing we really need to figure out was how to fit all of these gigantic egos into a single room and get them working together. Once we had done that, we had to deal with what was the best way to upgrade our infrastructure. And so we had to, at Heartland, we made the decision to just detangle the code from the infrastructure and lift it and shift it over into a pre-built, ready-made Azure system. And it was going to be beautiful, it was going to be easy, it was going to be wonderful, you'll love it. And at Factor, we did it a little bit differently. Rather than dealing with the archaic system, we decided to completely rebuild the entire thing from scratch because that was going to be way easier. You guys are going to love it. Both of these plans had their benefits. They had their pros and cons. Both of them had massive flaws that we'll get to. But in the end, I couldn't tell you which plan was better. Because in every situation, you're going to be faced with a different kind of code. You're going to be faced with a different kind of architecture. It's always going to be unique. So if you're expecting an answer to which way should I go with that, I'm afraid I don't have that. And anybody who's dealt with it will tell you that neither do they. So to begin with, in order to make this massive leap, we had to upgrade the technology that we were using. Now at Factor, we were still using desktops to do software development. Anybody who has ever experienced dealing with that knows that that's a really big deal, especially at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're getting a call to put out the latest dumpster fire. You don't want to have to get dressed and go into the office. It sucks. So first thing we had to do at Factor to get everybody on board and get everybody moving in the same direction was make sure that we had laptops. At Heartland, we already had laptops, thankfully, but almost everybody there was new to VSTS, now known as Azure DevOps. Nobody there was all that familiar with pipelines or with how to use ARM templates, so we had a lot of learning to do, a very steep learning curve. And we had a lot of trainings that had to be done to get everybody on board and everybody up to date. But not everybody really wanted to be up to date. It's easy to see from the outside looking in that we have to modernize or the company is going to fail, period, the end. Everybody's going to lose their jobs, life is going to suck. That's easy to see when you're not in the middle of the situation. But when you're in the middle of a stagnant culture surrounded by stagnant people, then you don't see that. What you see is people coming in with this idea of automation that is going to do what you do right now, which means your job is now going to be irrelevant. You see people coming in with new technologies that you don't understand and that you don't know how long it's going to take you to learn. And so you see your job at risk. Your life, your entire life's goals are being pushed out the window by these new guys who came in and said that they know what they're doing. So of course, there was a lot of resistance. There was people who were actively trying to sabotage the modernization effort at both companies. And so we handled this in very different ways. Factor had their management come out and say, all right, everybody listen very carefully. The new dev guys are in charge. Do everything they say, period, the end. Anybody who's ever worked in an office culture knows that that didn't work. And our resistance was not lessened at all and would become a huge issue moving forward. At Heartland, we handled it very differently. Heartland made sure that everybody understood the expectations in front of them, made sure that everybody knew that they had enough time to adapt, and gave them plenty of chances and opportunities and trainings and everything they needed to get up to speed. And the people who actively refused to do so all got fired. Now that might sound really harsh, but by the end of this, and I can tell you as an employee who lived through the Great Coaling, it was terrifying. But by the end of this, we had a unified team who was ready to move forward and who knew that the only direction to go was forward and who was ready and pumped and willing to make change happen. But change can be scary. And our team wasn't the only people that had to deal with this. Now, many of you here have had to work with change management teams. Several of you are probably on change management teams. A reasonable change management system is essential to a modern development environment. Whether we're talking about people, systems, or technologies, change management is a very, very useful asset to have. Heartland did not have a reasonable change management system. Heartland had the Ark. The Ark was a giant steaming pile of stop energy, at least where we were concerned. The Ark's primary purpose was to make sure no changes were made that were going to in any way risk harm to the system. Our team's goal was to have fast and frequent deployments. So we kind of conflicted on that. And so we did what every good technology person does when faced with an insurmountable obstacle. We went around it. We found a way to put up our infrastructure in Azure in our own tenant that we controlled, and any changes to the system went through us. And the only things we had to work through the Ark with was simple things like quick network changes and moving ports. And while that may have taken months to happen, it wasn't a perfect plan, it wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a solution, and it worked. Now that resistance that we saw wasn't just within change management, and it wasn't just in our team. If you walk into a room and tell them that they're doing everything wrong, and that now you're going to come in and make robots do it better and faster, then it's not going to make you a very popular person. So from the very beginning, when we came in and our business plan was stated and people knew what we were here for, there was already animosity starting to form, and it didn't help that there were people who were still working who were friends with a lot of those people at Heartland who had been let go. So there was a lot of friction from the outside in. And internal to the team, on both teams, in both situations, internal to the team, there were minor disagreements, there were fractures, there were things that we couldn't see eye to eye on. And this is the kind of thing that happens in every normal software development team. And I think, looking back, that our biggest mistake at Heartland specifically was thinking that this was a normal team, that this was a normal situation. But in the end, we knew that we had to make this work. The company was depending on us. Hundreds, in some cases thousands of jobs were depending on us. People's paychecks were literally depending on us. We had to make this work. And so we got our heads together, we started moving in the same direction, and we decided that we were going to make this happen. And at that point, we were rock stars. We were the people who were going to save the world. Our egos were up here. It was amazing. And we felt great. We were pumped, we were ready, we were excited, and we were able to accomplish anything. And we were wrong. We expected to have long calls and late nights. We expected to have ridiculously tight deadlines that were going to be very difficult to meet. But we did not see coming the massive amounts of stress that was going to put on us and the toll that was going to take on us individually and as a team. So from the very beginning, we know that Heartland had already lost several employees prior to the migration effort. And so they were already a little bit understaffed. And Factor never even hired enough. And so we were dealing with having a lot more work than we had people to do it. And within the first month, we started to see burnout. It was rough. We were talking about staying up all night coding and then coming back into work the next morning. Now, all of us have done that every once in a while. We were doing it every day. We had people who were working through the weekend. We were missing families with dinners with families. And we had to walk a tightrope between what we wanted and what we were able to accomplish and what business was trying to push on us, because we needed more resources. We needed a faster Azure tenant. We needed more servers in the cloud. We needed more computers. We needed more people. We needed this and that. And business was saying, you're here to make us money, not to spend it. So there was a lot of back and forth going on and a lot of pressure that built up on both sides. And the work just got harder. And the deadlines just got tighter. And every day we were reminded that our jobs and the jobs of everybody else in the company was on the line with this modernization effort. So we knew that we needed to do as much automation as possible. One of the main goals of the whole thing was to automate the system. But we didn't have the ability or the time to set up the automation before we started rebuilding everything. Anybody who's tried that knows that it's virtually impossible. So we had to build the infrastructure and the automation and write the code all at the same time, which means that we were dealing with some very shifting sand under our feet. We were trying to write code that was going to be deployed using pipelines that didn't exist and pointing to servers that weren't ready yet. It was not an easy task to do, and every day, the whole system looked different than the day before. So code that worked yesterday may not be working today. Systems that were very effective yesterday may not be effective today. And this led to some issues with boundaries. And we have a lot of people that knew what they were doing. Every full-stack developer at Heartland knew the basics of pipeline deployment by this time. Every developer at Factor knew how a database worked. We had the understanding to be able to be effective on our own. So under these tight deadlines and under the pressure that existed, we started siloing. Communication started to break down. We started saying, I can fix this, I can do it. You started hearing phrases like, ask for forgiveness, not permission, or progress doesn't care about your feelings. And these kind of issues cause a lot more work down the road because I might fix something here that Jack has already fixed over here, and now we have competing code, and it's going to take more time, it's going to take more pressure, and it's going to increase those squabbles and those little fractures inside the team. Every day, we would go home, we would try to go to sleep, and there would be some bell ring or something we'd have to fix right now, and so we'd fix it. And then we'd finally go to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then get back up and go back to work and start all over again. It was exhausting. Throughout the entire cloud migration, the pressure built. Throughout the entire cloud migration, in both Factor and at Heartland, we were getting pressure on all sides. We were getting people telling us to work faster, work better, get it done. Why isn't it done yet? Where is my results? And it was a lot to take in. It was a lot to deal with. And it was more than any one of us was really capable of handling on our own. And this is where Factor's story ends. Because at Factor, we had a very unique structure. We had our team, we had our manager, and above our manager was a CEO. And so our manager was getting all of that pressure dumped on him directly by the CEO, who was telling him that your job is on the line. All of these jobs are on the line and it's on your shoulders. And he was also getting pressure from the team saying, we don't have enough time. We don't have enough resources. Make it better, fix it now. Our manager, under all that pressure, couldn't take it and quit. And he didn't just quit. He left technology forever and went and became a scuba diving instructor. We broke the guy. And then his work didn't go away, and Factor didn't have the money to hire a new manager immediately, so his work went to us, and our work got spread more across the team, and so people started leaving. One guy actually had a nervous breakdown, which sounds entertaining until you're in the middle of it. It was rough, and a lot of us decided it was time to go look for better jobs, and that's when I ended up at Heartland, and took a lot of that knowledge and that experience with me. And so when we were seeing these same issues and these same cracks on the surface at Heartland, I knew that this was not going to end well if we didn't work together, if we didn't keep the lines of communication open, if we didn't fight to work together as a team, everything was going to fall apart. And so from the very beginning, from day one, and I'm not saying I myself, several people on the team were looking in the same direction, but we knew that communication and working together was central, and we fought to make that happen. And we put systems in place and people in place to make sure that that happened. But even at Heartland, by the end of our migration period, our optimistic deadline had long since passed. Our drop dead date, when we said we are absolutely going to have it into the cloud no matter what we promised, that was months ago. And we were wondering if there was ever going to be a light at the end of this tunnel. And then suddenly there was. Suddenly we were ready. Management said, hey, I think we're good to go. The team said, we are ready, we are pumped, let's do it. Management said, go. The system administrators hit the button, and our code was released into the world, where it all immediately broke. Our printers stopped printing, our workflows weren't working, and all of our fail-safes had failed. It was a mess. We spent a solid week trying to figure out how to fix these problems. We were up all night, every night. People were sleeping in the office. It was horrible. We had customers calling and complaining. We had our own employees calling and complaining. It was not a pleasant thing to live through. And if anybody here has not been through a situation like that, I really can't describe it. Our light at the end of the tunnel, it turned out to be a dumpster fire. Everything we had worked so hard on, all the pressure, all the fighting that we had done, had come out to this horrible mess, and everybody was mad. And it was rough, guys. Now, at Heartland, we have something called bell ringers. A bell ringer is when something is wrong and it's customer-facing, then our customer service representatives ring the bell, and they let us know, hey, there's a great big problem. In that first week, we had dozens of bell ringers. And you got to remember, we're a payroll company. Our product is people's livelihoods. Our product is food on the table of hundreds of thousands of families across this country. And our product wasn't going out. So, we did what every good technology person does when they're faced with an insurmountable obstacle. And we found a way around. We put together a team who managed to manually process hundreds of thousands of paychecks over the course of 2 days. Now, the second day, several of those paychecks were a day late. People were still angry, but we got them out. And we had food on the table for all those people. It was hard work, and I have to give an absolute kudos to the people who were involved in that hard work, specifically that team that put that together, because they stayed up for 48 straight hours working on this and making it happen. And they weren't the only ones staying up late. It's one of my favorite photos of the period during that massive dumpster fire. And this was a large portion of the team sitting there overnight. This was taken at about 10 o'clock at night. And they were all in there still working, still fighting, still trying to figure out how to keep this system running. In that first week, though, we had over 100 deployments. We had more deployments in that first week than we had had in the entire previous year leading up to it. All of our automation, all of our pipelines were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And when we got bugs, we were able to see them, fix them, and push them out almost immediately. Our system was doing exactly what our system was designed to do. All of our hard work was paying off, and it should have been our finest hour. That should have been our moment where we jump up and high five and say we did it. Somebody takes a picture. It would have been great. That didn't happen because we were surrounded by all of these pain points, all of these people who were saying it's not working, the system isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Our system was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, but the code was broken. The system was broken, and people were understandably angry. And I have to take a moment to shout out to one of our system administrators, a guy named Shaq, who during the first 48 hours of this release there was a bridge, and at any point in time, well, we're talking 2 o'clock in the morning, we're talking about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it didn't matter. You could get on this bridge, and Shaq was on the other end of that call. And he was listening, and he was working, and he was fighting the whole time, and I swear that guy didn't sleep at all. It's understandable, when faced with this kind of pressure, that those cracks that were already there, all those little office squabbles, would become a lot squabblier. All of those issues, all that tension and stress, people would start to get snappy. It was inevitable. And as the communication lines broke down, and as the pressure increased, and as we all lost sleep, we built up and built up and built up without any kind of release. Until one day, a developer tried to push out code to the cloud, and it wouldn't push. Somebody had changed something, and the code wasn't going. So this developer tracked down what had caused that issue, and he determined incorrectly that the issue was caused by a specific person. And he called out that specific person in a public channel on Slack. So in our text-based communication environment, he called out this person in public. And that person, who had nothing to do with the change, was understandably defensive. And so they were having a little text brawl back and forth. And other people tried to join in and make it better, and they got yelled at, and they got snapped at, but they were tired too. And so they were snapping back, and people were getting angry, and everybody was fighting. And it was the best thing that could have happened to our team. Because throughout all of this arguing, and it was a solid 2 hours of yelling back and forth in all capital letters, throughout all of this arguing, we realized eventually that what we were missing was solid communication lines. Even with all the hard work we had all put into keeping communication open, we had failed. The stress had worn us down, and we had messed everything up. So, from that point forward, we knew we had to keep those communication lines open, and every single person on that team fought to keep communication open and to work together as a team. And when I look back, I can tell you that the developer who originally sparked the explosion, who himself is not to blame because it could have been any of us, the developer who originally sparked that explosion doesn't like to talk about it because he sees it as a low point. It's a thing that happened, we're going to ignore it, we're going to move on. But in my opinion, that is the best thing that happened to our team. That was the moment that we became a team. And everything from that point forward was a lot easier. And I could tell you, I remember very clearly when we had our first weekend. So we had been working several weeks at this point. Through the weekends, every night, coming into work every day. It was horrible. It was exhausting. It was exhausting. And to explain this thing that's going on, I keep walking over here. I'm out of frame of the camera. I like to move around a lot, so I apologize for that. Anyway, that first weekend, I remember we came in on Monday. We'd had the entire weekend. There wasn't a single bell ringer. There wasn't a single issue that had popped up. And I remember we were all sitting around on Monday saying, all right, so who handled the issues this weekend? Because I didn't get any calls, so who was taking the calls? And we're all kind of looking around, staring at each other, and nobody was raising their hand. We realized that there wasn't any calls that weekend. There wasn't any bell ringers. And if ever we really had that we did it moment with the high five and the camera, if ever we really had that moment, that was it. When we were all sitting around, somewhat relaxed and well rested on a Monday morning saying, hey, nothing broke this weekend. It was a wonderful feeling. And I wish I could say that that was the end. We all lived happily ever after, problem solved, we did it, let's move on. But it wasn't, because we had made a lot of people very angry. We had lost a lot of trust within the company. Our system breaking down, our paychecks not going out on time, our payrolls not being processed when they needed to be processed, had caused a lot of issues and a lot of friction with these other departments who already weren't that happy with us. It took a lot of time and a lot of energy to build up that trust again. And it wasn't an easy thing to do, but the key to it, and this has been, I'm sure you've noticed, a running theme throughout this entire presentation, the key to getting this trust back was open communication. Our team, whenever we realized that there was a problem, we communicated that problem as quickly as we could to all the people who were going to have to handle that problem. And so they were able to proactively solve these issues before the customers even knew about them. A customer would call in and say, hey, this page isn't loading correctly. And the person would say, oh yeah, we already know about that. Go ahead and refresh your cache, you're good to go. And so with our quick turnaround times and our modern technologies that we were using, and with the trust, with the communication that we were able to build back up with our other team members, we were able to rebuild that trust. And when we rebuilt that trust with our coworkers, we rebuilt that trust with our customers. And over time, it's been several months, and I'm happy to say that last week I went out to a particular social gathering. I went to a bar, and I went to a bar with a couple of the administrators who deal directly with the customers. And I asked them how they felt our system was working. And they told me, in no uncertain terms, that, well, it was faster, and there was a lot less downtime. But faster doesn't mean fast, and less downtime doesn't mean no downtime, and the system wasn't perfect. But everybody who was there, who was talking to me very candidly, was able to tell me that they were secure in the knowledge that our system was stable. They were able to tell me that they were sure that when they had problems, there was going to be someone there to fix them, and that those fixes weren't going to take 6 to 9 months. And so we have to question, at this point, did we succeed? And this is really the most important part of this whole presentation. So if you haven't been listening to any of my other rambling up to this point, I understand, but listen now. Success is continuous. It doesn't end. It's not a stopping point. It's not the light at the end of the tunnel, because if you have reached that light at the end of the tunnel, if you are successful, that tunnel continues. Heartland is still in that tunnel. We are still continuing, and we will always be continuing. We will always be continuously innovating, continuously improving. We will always be working to make things better. This team that went through all of this and came out the other side, not exactly smelling like roses, I can tell you. This team, every single day, goes back into that office and continues to succeed. And everybody on that team who has lived through all of this comes in every day with an attitude that we can do this, we can make it better, and we can keep going. And if that's not success, I don't know what is. So to ask, did we succeed? That's a bit of a misnomer. But I would absolutely say that we are successful. Thank you all very much. I covered a lot and I talked very quickly, so I totally understand if there are questions, and I'm perfectly happy to answer them. We got one.
Thank you for sharing this story, actually. It's very interesting. I assume that you wouldn't want to live through this again. I assume that that's a correct statement. If that's so, what do you think, hindsight 2020, you could have done differently so the whole process was better, if it was up to you?
Primarily, if I had complete control over the process, I would say that we should segment the different pieces and work one at a time. If we had had our infrastructure built before we started trying to automate it, then everything would have been a lot smoother. And if we had had the infrastructure built and the automation completed before we started messing with the code, life would have been easy, comparatively. We didn't do that. We tried to work it all at once and tried to fix everything all at the same time, which turned out to be virtually impossible. An impossible feat that we managed, barely. Anybody else?
Do you have any advice for anyone going through the same thing at like a different company?
So you're asking if I have any advice for anybody else who is in a different company who's going through the same thing?
Things are chaos. No one knows what people are doing. What advice would you give?
Right, totally. Well, First thing I would say is make sure you keep those lines of communication open from beginning to end. Don't expect people to remember to communicate with each other. Don't expect people to take the extra steps necessary to reach out to each other. Put in systems in place and processes that make it so that people have to communicate. Make it so that before you put in changes to code, you have to put in a pull request, and somebody has to look at that pull request and approve the changes. Make it before you make changes to infrastructure. You have to have a comment in that change before the change will take place. Make sure that communication is built into the very structure of the team. And that would be my absolute suggestion there.
So you mentioned earlier how you mentioned earlier how you got to a point where you guys got in front of the big, monolithic change board or whatever. So did you guys have a relationship with that team after? And if you did, how did you repair that relationship with that team? Because it probably still exists, regardless of the system that you put in, right?
Well, at Factor, luckily for us anyway, it doesn't exist anymore. But at Heartland, yes, that team, to say that team is a little bit incorrect, because that team is our team. When we went through that process, it acted like a cauldron. It merged us all together into a single team. By the end of it, we were all one team. There was no the people who did it before. It was all us. We had these issues that we had to deal with, and we had to find ways to fix them. And we still have issues that we have to deal with, and we still all together have to work together to find ways to fix them.
You talked about where you got to the proactive stage and a customer would call asking about a problem, and you said, oh, we already found that problem, we're working on it, just refresh your cache and you're good to go. So do you have any advice on how to find customers that know what refreshing a cache means and how to do it?
That is an excellent question. What we did is we put out tutorials to all of the customers and said, follow these steps exactly in this specific browser. And if you follow these steps exactly, you should have this result. And if you don't have this result, please call us. So we taught them.
I think part of my question on the earlier one I had was to see if at Heartland you guys actually had an enterprise service management, team that helped, because you have service management team that are fielding calls and they're feeding into service desk, and you have that whole process, and they probably have feed into a change process, and there's release board, that kind of stuff. I was wondering if it was there and if you had that same experience working through that.
All those individuals are still there. And for the most part, they're all working in the same capacity. It took a lot of time and effort to rebuild that trust between us and them. But at this point, our code is stable enough and our system has been in place long enough that those individuals who were frustrated and holding the pitchforks in the previous slide are, at this point, a lot more on board with them. There's still some tension back and forth. There probably always will be, because we're on two different teams and we do two different things. But for the most part, those fast feedback loops and our ability to say, hey, you have a problem, let's fix it now, that has been the driving factor in bringing all of these groups together. Because it builds this idea, this relationship, that we are now one company. And we all have the same goal. And as long as we all have the same goal, we're all going to try to work together as much as we can. So it's not perfect. There's still some tension back and forth. There always will be. But it's a lot better than it was.
Yeah, a three-part question, I guess. Are there documented value propositions at Heartland or culture principles? And if so, were they updated? And if so, was there kind of like a policy deployment and saying, come on, let's all align and get on these new updated values?
That is a really awesome question. I could tell you that we do have value principles, and those value principles are core. We call them our core principles. They are the very center of everything we do, and I wish I could tell you off the top of my head what they all were. But the bottom line that goes into it, and has been for a long time, is we care. We care has been our guiding principle in development, in production, and for our customers. And that idea has not changed. We do evolve. We do have changes in those individual structures that more accurately point to the current environment, the current culture, and the people around us. But the central driving force of we care is always going to be who we are, I assume. Anybody else? All right, well, I appreciate all of you all coming out, and I appreciate you all listening to me ramble. Makes me feel good. I'm going to bring up Darian to I'm going to bring up Darian to take over here.
Awesome. Thanks, Drew. Everyone give it up for Drew. He did great for us. And I want to thank all of you guys for coming out today to support DevopsOKC. Again, my name is Darian. I'm on the corporate recruiting team with Heartland. I'm one of the co-organizers for this year. If any of you guys are interested in giving a talk, we meet the third Friday of the month at 11:30. So let me, Doji, Philip, or Steven know if you guys are interested